Why was this such an important story for you? In today's episode of The Culture Cat, we're talking with Dr. Tahir Jokinen, a psychiatrist with a background in South Asian history.
Muslim patients on the Indian asylum, and there's some Hindu and Sikh patients in the asylum that's now situated in Pakistan. So along with the sort of swaps in population that have happened, they get the idea that let's swap the asylum inmates.
Who wrote about the famous story of Toba Tek Singh. This is a story by one of the most celebrated authors in Urdu, called Saadat Hasan Manto, a fictional character going through an asylum swap built on very real-life circumstances where patients were moved across the new India-Pakistan border.
He's got these existential troubles, right? How does he make sense of his identity?
What it says about identity, belonging, and a history that India and Pakistan still hasn't fully reckoned with. This episode's out now. Listen to us on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube, and follow us on social media to find out more. So welcome to today's episode. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
The essay is about a story called Toba Tek Singh, and it's a story written by Manto. I wondered if you could give us your version of a synopsis of the story.
Sure. So it's probably Manto's most famous short story. I mean, he wrote hundreds, but this is probably the most famous one. Certainly the most famous one about partition. And it essentially tells the fictional story, or there's some basis in reality, of a lunatic asylum, as they were known at the time. A few years after partition, where it suddenly occurred to the government figures that we need to swap our patients over. So there's some, Muslim patients on the Indian asylum, and there's some Hindu and Sikh patients in the asylum that's now situated in Pakistan. So along with the sort of swaps in population that have happened, they get the idea that let's swap the asylum inmates. And this is suddenly announced, and then there's a sort of feverish build up to this event happening. And the story basically looks at that from the inmate's perspective of what on earth is happening. The day comes of the swap, and the idea is that the inmates are going to be marched across the border to their rightful destinations. And the sort of central character of the story, Toba Tek Singh, who's named after his village homeland, essentially sort of collapses in no man's land halfway across the border. In a sort of psychological sense, but also he dies there.
Right. Sounds like quite a sad story when you say it that way.
Yes, I mean, it's sort of presented like much of Manto's work, actually, with sort of quite matter-of-fact statements, humorous undertones at times, but the content is quite dark and depressing, and that's a theme for much of Manto's work.
Yeah, and you wrote an essay on it to look at the story through the lens of mental illness to help us understand that, I guess, in a cultural context. Why was this such an important story for you?
I think I first came across the story as a student of history, if you like, and it sort of struck a chord. There was something very, very powerful, I think, about the sort of metaphors. And I then sort of came to psychiatry kind of a bit later, and just found myself thinking back to this story and thinking that actually, the sort of madness as a metaphor was something I'd kind of maybe taken for granted a little bit earlier, kind of looking at it purely from the perspective of a historian, and sort of wanted to give a bit more thought to.
And what did you think of the story when you first read it? So even the way you've described it, it sounds so absurd to me, the fact that, a few years after partition, they've realized let's do the swap. So what did you think of that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it seems sort of a ridiculous thing to do, but as with much of the machinations around sort of partition and post-partition South Asia, there were many absurd things done. So it doesn't necessarily stand out, sadly.
Yeah. And the other thing I noticed with the story when I was reading it is when Bishan Singh gets frustrated, he mutters the only way I can describe it is like a string of nonsensical words, like a sentence that doesn't make sense. But you can say that he's kind of just saying things about India, Pakistan, in a mix of, Hindi, Urdu, English. And what did what did that mean? Because it happens often throughout the story.
Probably some Punjabi as well. Yeah, I think, I mean, initially you just think that it's just nonsense. And that's sort of how it's set out to be. But if you look at some of the words, you know, there's Pakistan, government. Right. This comes up a lot, you know, government. And if you think, you know, for this character, I'm not sure that he'd have never, you know, necessarily come across these words kind of before Partition and what followed it. I don't think the concept of government would have necessarily meant much to him. You know, what's Pakistan? It means absolutely nothing to you know, sort of the ordinary person on the village level.
Yeah.
And now suddenly, you know, the news is full of this stuff. Everything's sort of talked about through this lens, and it's in your face. So it's no surprise that he's kind of picking up on these mutterings and incorporating these words, which to us sound sort of very grand and important, but are actually kind of quite nonsensical in terms of the connection that they have with his life.
Yeah. And even what you mentioned about his name being, you know, it's not really a name. It's just the region where he's from. It's not a name that means more than that, essentially. And there's another quote in the story where he says, all those lunatics in the asylum who had at least some sense left were uncertain whether they were in Pakistan or India. If they were in India, then where was Pakistan? If they were in Pakistan, how could it be possible when only a short while ago they had been in India without having moved at all? Now, I cannot fathom that, having to process that, you know, in a normal state of mind, let alone if I'm suffering from mental illness. So what do you think Manto meant by that in terms of belonging and identity in someone whose very name is after the region that they're born in?
I think there's a lot going on there. I think one is just the whole absurdity of the whole question and issue of, you know, where is India, where is Pakistan, you know, how has this all come about? And the whole thing obviously does seem absurd, and you know, that's the theme of the story. But I think there's a bit more there about sort of how one positions oneself in terms of identity and in terms of belonging, and actually that's very tied to a geographical place. And it's tied to the soil, in fact. You look at sort of wrestlers in South Asia in the traditional way, and the first thing they do on entering the ring is they touch the soil, right? And, you know, the sort of metaphors of you know, Mother India and these kind of things, it's all tied into to the sort of land itself. And suddenly it doesn't mean what it used to mean, right? We've got these new sort of borders being supplanted on top. And I think one of the sort of big tragedies of partition, which I think we don't sort of necessarily recognize so much, is a loss of sort of tie to the more regional and even sort of smaller scale sense of belonging and locality. Because now it becomes about which nation state you fall in, and that takes precedence. Whereas for Toba Tek Singh, it's the village, it's Toba Tek Singh. That is where he belongs. And it's irrelevant, actually, what the sort of nation state around that is. But we lose that because after partition, everything has to be understood in the sense of, you know, is it India? Is it East Pakistan, West Pakistan, or, you know, Bangladesh post 1971? And I think we sort of forget that.
Yeah. And it did make me think a little bit about, I mean, it's on a completely different scale, but I guess how we partition patients here, how we separate patients by borough, how we separate, you know, we draw a line and say, I cover this area, which you have to practically based on your resources. But also it sort of throws into question how people feel in these sort of, you know, movements, in these shifts in populations where they have no control over it. And suddenly your meaning of self, belonging, where you can go to for help completely changes, how you make sense of that. And I wondered, is that something that you think is going to be a never-ending problem in how we approach care?
One would hope not. But I don't see a way out, to be honest. I mean, it's not just there in care itself. I mean, even Manto's own migration to Pakistan followed, you know, the fact that his family went first, and then sort of he got worried and kind of rushed to join them. And then it did become about those divisions. But yeah, I mean, it's we definitely see it now. It's the arguing over which institution takes responsibility for someone based on usually a fairly arbitrary border that's drawn, and that could be a physical, geographical distinction, or it could be other sort of exclusion criteria. But I think it takes away from the sort of having an authentic connection to some source of help, in a way that it just becomes a sort of nameless, faceless institution, which has its kind of entry criteria. And I mean institution in a sort of broader sense, even if it's not a physical building, but a team that takes responsibility.
And speaking of institutions, there's another quote in the story where he says, a madman in Lahore asylum asked another madman, why did they divide India? The other said, to make more asylums. Now, I guess there's a couple of ways you could interpret that. It could mean, for example, that the world is going mad. We need more asylums. Or it could mean that we're being more institutionalized in some ways. What's your thought on that quote?
Again, it's another interesting one. Sort of more to make more asylums. You have to ask the question, I think, of who benefits from this and who profits from this and who's kind of driving that.
Yeah.
And this just sort of came to me now, but it sort of links you back to the colonial project, which was all about sort of creating boundaries, creating definitions, and creating institutions, that people are split up into. And of course that was done for control. It was done often for kind of economic reasons. It's far easier to exploit when people are sort of tied into these, quite rigid boundaried groupings. So I think there's an element of that, and the sort of post-colonial states are also desperate to assert control and establish control. And a big way to do that is to be incredibly exclusionary about who is able to access, whatever rights that the state owes its citizens, who are now born and have to be sort of negotiated. What that citizenship means. Yeah,
and I think sometimes people don't realise that asylums were a very British and colonial concept that were introduced in a lot of what we now call Commonwealth countries. So actually the first, the Indian Lunatic Asylums Act was introduced in 1858 by the British Empire, the British government, to control and manage asylums. And that was basically a way for them to pick up people wandering on the street, presumed insane by their definition, to be incarcerated for life in these institutions most often. And there's a paper called Lunatic Asylums, A Business of Profit During the Colonial Empire in India, which talks about this political power over India by the British East India Company, and to bring in these British models of asylums and basically use them as a form of generating profit, which I think is really interesting in the context of looking at how Manto describes the experience in the story. So it's not that he is just talking about partition from the lens of India, Pakistan, people that live there, but what it means with this kind of colonial overarching power over it.
Yeah, I'd also add sort of historically in 1958, we're talking about immediately post the, whether you want to call it the First War of Indian Independence, whether you want to call it the mutiny, whatever term you choose. And I think, this is a time when the British are being confronted with a problem of governance that hasn't erupted on that scale before. And it's also the move from East India Company to kind of Raj rule and a completely different institutional framework behind that. And the asylum can become one way of kind of dealing with people that you potentially are threatened by or sort of can't fit otherwise. And the same situation will happen post-partition as the new nation states negotiate where they stand. You're also going to have these people that are a threat to that and just don't fit. Yeah.
And do you know, because I do find that fascinating that it happened in real life, that people were being swapped between these institutions. Do you know if we know much about that? Do we have literature? Do we have scientific records of it?
No, so there's some archival records somewhere. There is a psychiatrist has done some research into it that this did happen, but it's, as far as I know, it's just one isolated study. And actually, Amritsar and Lahore, so the same sort of places as the story is set in. Probably this has happened in other asylums as well, but it's a scope to be explored, surely.
And the most kind of prominent literature I found in terms of, I guess, non-fiction accounts or published books, but all written around 2017, 2018 kind of time. What do you make of that? Because, for example, there's a book called The Psychological Impacts of the Partition of India. There's another book called The Unsafe Asylum, both published in 2018. Why so far down? Why not a few years after?
Yes. I think there's a number of different factors here. One is that sort of wider currents and how comfortable it feels to be sort of psychologizing about things is one factor. I don't think in sort of early 1950s there was this kind of discourse around things. But I think more importantly, there needed to be some space.
Yeah.
There needed to be some space after partition. I don't think you could go in immediately after and start dissecting this out because it's just too raw and it's just too real still. It's still a lived, ongoing experience. And if you look at how certainly my knowledge is more on India, but how partition has been kind of represented, how it's been taught in schools, it was glossed over.
Yeah.
Right? For decades and decades, it was just a footnote in the history books. And it was just something that was too uncomfortable to go anywhere near. So I think it naturally, some distance is just needed to start even going there.
And that brings me on to the scientific work that we've done, post-partition, because if we look at, for example, PTSD, if we look at a lot of the work we've done in the West, it has been post-conflict, it's been post-war, we've been able to take time to analyse. Do you think there is scope for that now? Do you think there's some sort of work to be done? Or do you think the frameworks we already have, like PTSD, explain the experience of partition?
I struggle with this a lot, and it's something I sort of, I'm not sure how I feel about. First thing I would say is, no, the PTSD framework doesn't explain anything, okay? So PTSD is very culturally specific. It came about, as we refer to it, post-Vietnam War. Yeah. Suddenly you need to know what to do with all of these war veterans and the unique difficulties of living that they're facing. And now we've sort of, quite uncritically, I think, just rolled out PTSD across every type of, experience that could be considered difficult or traumatic. So that's a massive problem. I think if partition happened now, you'd have a wave of sort of trauma counsellors rushing in, seeking to sort of do this work. And again, I think that is problematic in and of itself. I think the sort of most important thing is actually recognizing that people respond to difficulties in very different ways. And there are cultural modes of making sense of and kind of working through these difficulties that do not fit a PTSD lens and do not fit a sort of trauma counselling, trauma therapy lens. And actually trying to impose that over these cultural understandings is massively problematic. Yeah. So that would be one of the sort of things I would caution. The other thing is that actually the sort of day-to-day necessities of kind of food and shelter and basic safety. And actually, if you look at the history of partition, it wasn't one single event. Right. In Punjab, it was much more sort of quick and over, but in Bengal, it was much sort of longer. And you didn't have one sort of catastrophic flame of violence. It was much more drawn out and over sort of decades, actually. And in that context, it's a very, very different experience when you're living in that ongoing uncertainty. And again, that's not sort of captured by the PTSD sort of model. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think there's a lot of talk about collective trauma. when it comes to people looking at partition and the psychological impact. I wonder what your thought is on that, and in terms of an approach for collective trauma. So do our approaches need to be collective as well, rather than the one-to-one therapy that we're used to?
Yeah. The difficulty becomes kind of what's collective, because partitions cut through communities, right? And I think that's probably a part of what sort of made partition unique among sort of many horrors, is that before the community could kind of, repair itself and come together to do that. And post-partition, that's not necessarily possible. You've got families split, stuck on either side of the border.
And just to remind people who might not have read about partition, we're talking about, overnight neighbors turning on each other, neighboring villages that would celebrate Diwali and Eid together, burning each other's houses. So it was an incredibly sad, but, completely inexplicable change in human nature almost.
Exactly. And how you make sense of that, how these sort of ties of belonging, these horizontal ties that are sort of deep and lived and experienced, as you say, celebrating each other's religious festivals together, all of that is kind of completely cut through, as you say, overnight. So then how do you make sense of that, and what kind of collective response is then possible that doesn't deepen actually some of the lines of separation, because now people are separated. And then it does become us versus them. Yeah.
And that brings me on to thinking about how we explain this psychologically. So there's a few theories that we've come across that can explain, I guess, the question on everyone's mind about why do these moments of mass violence happen? How can people turn on each other in these violent ways in crowds, in mobs? I wonder what your thoughts were about that, because we've got a couple of theories in front of us that we could go through.
And my initial thought was, I wish I could understand.
Yeah.
Right? Because, of course, it doesn't make any sense.
Right.
And I think that's what sort of draws a lot of people to thinking about partition and sort of asking about it. And I think also explains the kind of silence and the desperation to forget and not talk about it.
One thing I wanted to ask you was, there's a couple of theories that I guess that it's important to note for each of these theories don't fully explain and will never fully explain. And it's, I guess, our point of view to take, it's kind of like a pick and mix of what makes sense to our minds. But there's, for example, the moral disengagement theory by Bandura talks about how people stop applying their moral standards when they perceive violence as necessary. So, for example, I have to protect my community. People are coming to burn them down, so I need to kill them. Versus Arendt's work on banality of evil through, the Holocaust and talking to Nazi bureaucrats, and where she talked about actually it's not so much about moral breakdown, but just the lack of the faculty of thinking to get to that point in the first place, because you as a human aren't afforded to think for yourself. So it's almost saying it's not that these people are sadistic, it's just they are failing to even think independently because of this kind of totalitarian movement that's taken them over, which are quite, contrasting to themselves. But I wondered, out of that, what do you think applies to partition?
I think it's more a sort of total breakdown of everything, right? When everything that you have sort of ever known and has been something you can sort of ground yourself with, has been completely torn asunder. And I mean, we sort of see it. We see it in sort of some of our own patients, here, who experience moments where they are just completely, out of control and uncontained in the sort of psychological sense, because they just don't have that kind of touchstone to ground them and to kind of refer back to. So I guess when that's happening all around you, yes, the violence seems very inexplicable to us, but you can see why sort of every faculty would break down. And it's, not just the kind of moral aspects, but even sort of necessities of survival come into it.
Yeah. Actually, that brings me on to exactly what I was going to say next, which was the concept of de-individuation, where you kind of group identity takes over from your personal. So, for example, violence in partition often happened in crowds. So trains, villages, refugee caravans. So it's almost like, yes, there were people targeting individuals, but more often than not, it was this kind of nameless group that I guess you didn't have to personally connect with.
Yes, exactly. And what's sort of remarkable is how effectively that is created in the sort of public consciousness, that you can drum up this idea of an enemy, which is entirely sort of fictional, but sort of becomes so powerful. And I think that the sort of the crowd nature of it comes through a lot in some of Manto's other work, and I think that's sort of partly fits quite nicely with his sort of tone of being so matter of fact about all of this. You know?
Yeah, that's the thing. And he's so matter of fact about the very concept that tore people apart, which is a social identity. He's like, am I in Pakistan? Am I in India? And it's often talked about in this, in a very religiously charged matter, which it was. But also it was almost like an existential crisis people were having, wasn't it? It wasn't just that they were saying, I'm Muslim and you're Hindu. It was almost people saying, you will destroy me because of who I am, therefore I must act. So it kind of makes you feel a bit sad for both sides, both, people that were facing violence and the people that were, I guess, the agents of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to be in that position where that becomes the only way that you can see.
Yeah. And I guess we've talked a lot about Western psychological theory. So I want to touch on a couple of non-Western theorists who looked at violence through, I guess, a colonial lens. And one person that comes to my mind is Frantz Fanon. And he talked a lot about the psyche's revolt against colonial humiliation, and not to justify violence, but to, I guess, explain and understand it. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think we need more of these kind of colonial lens or views coming through to explain partition?
I think you can't take it away from its historical context, for sure. And thinking particularly in the Punjab, what you had in terms of some of the massacres that took place kind of under colonial rule, not more than sort of less than 30 years before partition, kind of setting a precedent for how things are handled as well. I think you can't see it outside of that context. I'm reluctant to sort of put everything in a colonial lens.
Yeah, I agree.
Partly because I think we need to also give agency to people on the ground, for whom, particularly the lunatics in the asylum, I'm not sure the colonial project would have kind of meant much to them, and they wouldn't have been necessarily, at least actively engaging with these ideas. That's there in the background and has an influence on things. But I think we risk kind of losing sense of their agency in other ways. Yeah. If everything comes through a sort of colonial lens, but it's definitely there.
Yeah, absolutely. Because that's one thing I was wondering because Fanon talks about in A Wretched of the Earth, he talks about this divide and rule concept in communal violence when it comes to colonial settings, where rage is displaced horizontally. So because you can't attack your, I guess, rulers and the vertical power, and it collapses, it then diffuses out to people that live closer, which makes sense. But I sometimes do wonder whether the violence would have been inevitable because of the build up to how things were happening at the time in relation to communities in India, and how the British were really fragmented and institutionalized and almost created a hierarchy between different religions, castes, occupations. So what are your thoughts on that?
I hesitate to call anything inevitable. I think there's a real question of, once you've got a British empire establishing itself over, an India, which is essentially a collection of sort of, disparate collection of princely estates and other kind of empires and other forms of kind of governance. You can't go back to that, right? Yeah. Once these things are destroyed, because they've all evolved sort of organically. So then what's left? Because anything that you go to is going to be in some way foreign or in some way new or some way imposed. So even if you impose a united, independent South Asia, whatever you want to call it.
That would have been nice.
Of course. And we look back on it and we think, that would be lovely. Although there's many people that would, again, that cuts at their identity.
So true.
But what would that actually mean? That would come with its own problems and its own senses of how do you negotiate belonging and identity? How do you craft a sort of national identity that makes you a citizen of a modern nation state? And how does that interplay with your sense of belonging, like Toba Tek Singh, to his village, which is much more important.
Exactly. And I think that brings me back to the story because it revolves around madness. The story is about madness, and it's both about madness of the patients and madness of the situation. And I guess some people in critical psychiatry talk about this often, about whether actually we pathologize madness when it could be a logical response to the chaos around you. Yeah, I don't know what you think of that in the situation.
I think madness as a sort of metaphor there is incredibly prevalent around partition. And, as you say, it can be a reaction to something that just, is intolerable or kind of doesn't make sense. The question of pathologizing is difficult because I'm not sure how much people were pathologizing when they referred to madness, or even when they referred to sort of lunatics in an asylum.
Yeah, because Gandhi, for example, talks about the madness of Delhi, people in Delhi during the violence of partition, and pleads for a return to sanity, quote unquote. And when Gandhi was assassinated, Nehru talks about how a madman has put an end to his life. For I can only call a mad who did it. And yet there has been enough of poison spread in this country during the past years and months, and this poison has had an effect on people's minds. So you're right, it was very much a metaphor, not just in fiction and literature, but across, political movements.
Yeah, and the meaning of that's different. I mean, now we rush in pathologizing, we sort of start bringing out the DSM and ICD and whatever not, and sort of what kind of mental disorder are we going to diagnose this person with and whatever. And I think we lose sight of the fact that unlivable conditions create problems and they create suffering. And I think that's something that comes through really strongly in the discourse around this time. It's just madness, and we don't need to break down this madness anymore. We don't need to kind of start subclassifying it and sort of finding biological causes for it and this and that treatment. It is madness because it's born out of these circumstances. And now let's look at what we can do to change the conditions so that this madness doesn't spread, if you like.
Yeah. And actually, you have I really like this in your article where you analyze this short story. You say, the publication of the story may itself have had some impact on the exclusionist popular ideas or attitudes towards the mentally ill that were so prevalent at the time. So what did you think the story did for, mental health stigma itself during that time?
Stigma is difficult. So one way of reading this story would be that it's incredibly stigmatizing, right? You're using asylum lunatics as a metaphor for the madness of what's going on. How stigmatizing to do this, right? These are people that are desperately ill, they're suffering, and, how dare you do this, right? That's one way of reading it. In a sort of very modern kind of anti-stigma, mental illness can happen to anyone, and how dare you make a spectacle out of these people? But I don't think that's the point at all, actually. We have to remember that there is no anti-stigma campaign, and to my knowledge, anywhere in the world at this time, right? These have all come much later. And the kind of modern discourses of stigma in mental health simply didn't exist. I think what Manto does is, and in much of the rest of his work as well, he kind of depicts and sort of engages with that kind of dark underbelly of society, the sort of seedy bits, the bits that aren't respectable to engage with, the prostitutes feature heavily in a lot of his stories. And I think to an extent he sort of rehabilitates these characters as just human. Yeah. Right? And they are the product of the circumstances and conditions around them. And he really rehabilitates, I think, their humanity in a way that isn't sort of really self-conscious and anti-stigma. It's just there.
Yeah.
It's matter of fact. And when you read this story, it becomes obvious that, these asylum lunatics, there's nothing mad about them at all compared to what's going on around them. The madness is all external.
Yeah.
And again, it just comes through in such a sort of unself-conscious, matter-of-fact way that I think you just are hit with it and you realize it without sort of having a sense that there's any particular message there. It just sort of happens. And I think that also links to how I guess sort of mental illness might have been experienced at the time outside of the institutional setting. It's a problem for the community. And yes, that did lead sometimes to quite exclusionist approaches, a lot of coercion potentially, kind of locking people up in a way and chained and whatever, which still continues, of course. But I think there was also a scope for people to find meaning for that madness within the community around them.
Yeah, so almost I don't want to say collective, because it's so, I think sometimes when you use the word collective, you homogenize a response. But I want to say almost like it's like a group project. So let's figure out a solution together. Yes. Sometimes for the benefit of the patient, sometimes for the benefit of the community.
Of course.
At the expense of the patient. But it's almost as if, like it takes a village to raise a child.
Sure.
The approach I've seen in India is that it takes a village to look after someone, whether it's mental illness or physical illness. So I completely see what you mean by that. And I think in that sense, you do kind of have to have a matter-of-fact attitude about it.
Yeah,
you have to say
it's the only way.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you can't get on with it. It's a matter of just survival day to day.
Yeah.
And you've got no other choice.
Yeah.
Of course, what institutions do is they cut across all of that. So now it becomes the institution's problem.
Right.
And the institution is the one that defines what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, who is sick, who is not sick, who needs what type of support. All of that is taken out of the community.
Yeah. And you know what, maybe I'll do a separate episode on this, but what I found fascinating when researching this topic was that they had separate asylums, obviously, for what they call natives and for, I guess, white British people that were living in India at the time. And it did make me wonder whether practice is different. Did they have, different caliber of staff? Did they have different therapeutic activities? Because I can't imagine that the Indian asylums were very much run in a culturally competent way during the time of the empire. Unless, of course, it was run by someone that cared about those things. But it did make me wonder, how would it have been different?
I have absolutely no idea. And there's a research project in there somewhere. But there's a difference between institutions that are being run by sort of very technical staff and institutions that aren't. And we obviously know that sort of a lot of professional life in sort of even early 20th century India was about proving one's ability or competence or professional legitimacy, very much in the mold of Western professional competency, right? So it's about studying at the same institutions. It's about showing that you're on a par and on a level with that, and kind of beating the British at their own game.
Yeah.
And I wonder, and I don't know, this is just sort of me hypothesizing here, but I wonder whether actually the sort of medical side would have been the same.
Right.
And being sort of more Western than Western in terms of the practice of psychiatry. So obviously, even in the West at this point, psychiatry is in a fairly sort of nascent stage of development. But whether it's about the sort of asylum superintendents and kind of being very research focused on sort of classification and what have you not, I don't know. Or would it have been left to sort of less professional people who might have been able to be sort of more caring in a much more natural, holistic way, and a way that's kind of more appropriate for the community setting?
The other thing that was quite striking was Manto's own mental health struggles. So he struggled with depression, addiction. How much of that do you think weaves into his stories, or this story, for example?
Well, I think first of all, it's difficult diagnosing any historical figure, but certainly Manto grappled with sort of existential crises, crises of identity. If you look, I mean, he was always fond of a drink, but the sort of real alcoholism only came post migration to Pakistan, and the sort of certainly him sort of drinking himself to death, which is of course a parallel with a lot of figures in the Bollywood industry as well. And we have to remember that Manto was a writer for Bollywood for much of his career.
And actually, that's a good point that you raised, because I think articles refer to him as having depression and addiction, and I kind of paraphrase that. But you're right; he actually wasn't officially, as far as I'm aware, diagnosed.
No, I think he might have. There might have been a sort of stint in some kind of rehab thing. I'm not sure. I may have just made that up. But yeah, I think the problem with diagnosing Manto, I mean, diagnosing any historical figure is ethical problems, whatever. But the real problem is, and this can become a problem with diagnosing anyone with mental illness, is that if you start calling it depression, then you take away the whole meaning of his experience, right? And he's got these existential troubles, right? How does he make sense of his identity? His kind of the decision for him to migrate from at the time Bombay to eventually Lahore, where he ends up, it was quite a sort of spur of the moment snapshot decision. He had no intention of kind of going to Pakistan initially. He'd been quite happy to stay in Bombay, but then the sort of situation around him is so unstable that it's a kind of spur of the moment. You know what? Maybe I need to do this. And then he spends the rest of his life really grappling with that and trying to make a sense of where he is and how he belongs and what his identity is in that context. So, to start calling that depression, I think takes away the meaning of that. And now it's, maybe it's just something wrong with his brain or whatever. You've lost actually his whole experience, and he's not the only one that's grappling with this.
Yeah.
And of course, he had his demons, if you like, even sort of prior to Partition. He was always a bit of a sort of dodgy character in terms of how he was moving from, ramshackle room to the next one. And, I think he talks in some of his writing about, every time he moved, bed bugs falling on him off the ceilings and moving in his sleep. And he's kind of going around scrounging for money, these kind of short-term contracts and whatever. He's very much living in the underbelly of society that he writes about. He's not just
he's very much an up-and-coming. Right.
Yeah, exactly. And again, his kind of sense of how does he belong, where does he fit in? But that's not unique to him. I mean, Bombay as a city is sort of, I think, characterized by that. It's people trying to find their place in the world and make it.
Yeah, especially in the creative community, right?
Exactly.
I'm sure that,
Exactly. And that is a difficult process, and a process that can be quite fracturing, I think. It's no wonder that sort of problems that we might refer to as mental illness arise in them. And perhaps the alcoholism is an escape, it's a way out of facing the sort of reality of living.
So actually there's a lot of parallels between him and the character he writes about. Because sometimes it's actually quite disorienting when you read the story. You're kind of like, I don't know what this person's thinking. I don't know where they are. And it feels like it's almost a deliberate way to disorient the reader, which is quite clever, actually, a clever way to write. And another thing that Manto does touch on, which I guess we're talking about far more now than would have been talked about earlier on, closer to Partition, is the violence that women faced, as women, as a population do in, I think, a lot of conflicts, a lot of wars. Women are targeted, and he does touch on it actually in this story. And I don't know if in others he's talked about women
much more so, actually.
Yeah. And I wondered, was that something that writers of that time did? Was he someone that stood out as someone writing about women?
He stood out for the graphic way that he wrote about certain women, shall we say. And he was, as we know, sort of tried for obscenity in multiple occasions, actually, for his writings. His sort of response to that was, look, I'm just describing what's happening. If you find my stories obscene, then go and look at the society that I'm writing about. Which is again, a very matter-of-fact but powerful response. But yeah, absolutely. I think he was acutely aware of sort of the challenges that women faced, particularly in the underbelly of society. Women as the sort of victims of a lot of kind of sort of what we might call mundane, everyday, banal type of violence that doesn't erupt on this kind of public scale, but is being experienced kind of on a daily basis in homes, all over the place. That's one of those things. And I think also for sort of some of his other works, and I'm thinking particularly here about Koldo, which is another story sort of set in the immediate days of partition, I guess. The sort of role of women representing something that is at threat, honor, yes, but also kind of being the guardians of our identity and sense of belonging. And when that is under threat, the violence against women is very real, but it's also kind of very symbolic of that being threatened, and being attacked.
And I guess it makes me wonder, and this is a difficult, I don't think this is an answerable question, but I'm going to say it anyway. In those contexts, it makes me wonder when we attribute something to madness, quote unquote. And, lots of, all of the freedom fighters did, well, not all of them, quite a few of them did, Manto did, and it was a way to try and make sense of something that was insensible. Do we absolve responsibility in some way by saying, oh, it was a moment of madness, no one knew what they were doing, or no one was in their right mind? And does it then not do, justice to these women that suffered, to these, populations that were targeted in the name of, I guess, conflict and partition?
I think you're right. I think to an extent we do absolve responsibility, and it becomes just something, we're not going to go there. Right. And I think in some ways that can be needed. If the circumstances are such that it is intolerable to live in that reality, then sometimes you need that sort of cloak of madness to just get through this somehow. And sometimes you don't want to go. And again, this comes back to the sort of whole trauma counselling, what have you not. But sometimes it is not helpful to go and start unpicking all of this. So in that sense, and that's true for the individuals that are sort of perpetrating it. It's true for the individuals that are on the sort of receiving end and sort of, direct victims of it. So in that sense, kind of throughout all of human history, madness has that sort of power to kind of, I guess, give a brief temporary permission to step outside the bounds of what would be normal. But yes, you're right. I think if that's taken too far, and too much is excused underneath the sort of umbrella of madness, then yes, we are absolving people of responsibility. And again, I come back to sort of what sort of institutions and what sort of the medical model does. It takes away the role of the community in sanctioning what is absolvable and what isn't. Right? So if you're mad and that's it, and you're in the community, your madness has to be something that the community are willing to excuse you for and excuse you from responsibilities and provide that kind of care. And it's the community that are the judge of how long you are to be absolved of responsibility. Once that function is taken over by the psychiatrist or the psychiatric system, that is now completely divorced from the community, and it's the psychiatric system that decides whether you are to be absolved of responsibility or not. And I think in a way, there's a parallel, I think, here with what the nation states are doing by kind of, and the sort of leaders of the nation states who are wanting to kind of move on from this and establish their sort of new citizenship and what have you not, and look to the future and sort of celebrate independence. Madness is a very comfortable way of just painting over all of this.
Yeah. And that also, I think, touches a little bit on when people talk about intergenerational trauma, because I'm seeing quite a lot of, I guess, therapists, South Asian therapists popping up on the scene who are interested in it, who want to talk to people about it, who I guess are encouraging people to talk to their family members. And I sense a level of frustration that maybe, grandfathers and great grandmothers haven't talked about this at all with their children and grandchildren, and whether this is a topic that we should be talking about in families.
I think there's no easy answer. I think on the one hand, that's encouraging that we can have these conversations if we need to and if we want to, and that we're recognizing actually that the sort of things that partition set in motion have their reverberations to the present day, and in terms of sort of uprooting people, disturbing people's identity, and these are sort of unsolved and unresolved issues. So on the one hand, I think that's can be helpful and can be healthy. On the other hand, I think for a lot of people that experience these horrors, they experienced it, they somehow lived through it, and that's happened. And that's in the past. Much like someone who has a psychotic episode, you know, they may not be able to tell you what was going on at the time because it was just too much, and that sort of escape from reality is the only way to survive through that. And you are not going to expect them much later to go back into that and start unpicking that. And I don't think we can expect people to do that unless they would like to. And I think we should welcome the opportunity to do that if people want to, but I don't think we should be forcing that on people. And I think if they prefer to, you know, have that left where it is, then that's absolutely fine.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with you on that. And I wanted to finish with a last quote from the story. And this is the last sentence in the story, actually. And of course, this story has been translated. And this is the interpretation of it, because I find this often, actually, with stories that are translated. It's almost like an interpretation of the story rather than a literal translation most times.
Absolutely.
So
I mean, my article, I worked with the story in the original Urdu, and where I've referred to quotes, I've sort of translated them myself.
Perfect.
Appreciating that it's probably less you lose some of the literary eloquence of
exactly.
professional translations, but I think it keeps you more connected with the material.
I completely agree. And it says, there behind barbed wire was Hindustan. Here behind the same kind of barbed wire was Pakistan. In between, on that piece of ground that had no name, lay Toba Tek Singh. And you said this at the start when you summarized and said at the end he's just lying in no man's land. He kind of collapses there. What happens? Does he die? Do we find out?
Yeah, the implication is he dies, and that he's buried there.
Right.
And that this becomes Toba Tek Singh because he's buried there.
Right.
And no one knew where Toba Tek Singh was, that he kept talking about. And therefore he, in his kind of final moment, I guess, he's got this chance at some agency and he claims that land again for himself. And it's Toba Tek Singh, and it does not matter whether it's in Pakistan, whether it's in Hindustan, Bharat, whatever. It does not matter. It is Toba Tek Singh.
And even in that last moment, he noticed, behind the same kind of barbed wire. So he's still trying to piece. It's the same.
It's the same. Yeah. And either way you look at it, there's something, this guy is sort of, he's died a lunatic, he's died in a sort of midst of a psychotic episode. So there's that kind of distance. You're looking at someone kind of strangely. But both sides are looking at him strangely in exactly the same way. And in the middle of it all, he's just an older man that has collapsed onto the ground in a desperate sort of sadness and confusion.
And it's a remarkable way to end it, because the whole time you spend thinking this person is mad, as they describe it in the story, but actually is he the only one that makes sense?
Yes.
In the madness.
Yeah, exactly. And actually it's his last act of resistance. He does not get transferred, right?
Yeah.
He resists that to the end.
Well, thank you so much for joining today. That was a fascinating conversation, and I'm hoping I can have you back at some point in the future for something else. But that's the end.
Absolutely. I'd be pleased to. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Culture Gap. Our guest episodes drop on the last Sunday of every month. If this conversation made you think differently about mental health, there's a lot more coming. Follow us on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts, and find us on social media to connect. One story at a time.